Yes. So welcome to my presentation. I did not think of saying the name out loud, so I apologize because it's a tongue twister. So over the past 2 years at Whitman, we had undergone a rigorous metadata cleanup project to prepare our repository ARMINDA for migration from Islandora 7 into Islandora 8. Now, to give a little background in ARMINDA, ARMINDA is, as I said, our repository for Whitman College. We have 6 main collections. Within those main collections, we have about 150 sub-collections. And across all of our collections in ARMINDA, we had 158 unique fields that had never gone any type of metadata cleanup, review, or process of any kind. And so, as you might imagine, it would be kind of challenging to migrate metadata that had not undergone any type of review. So the first thing that I did in regards to our metadata was to figure out what the path was. So what that means is just knowing where our metadata had come from. And so that meant knowing our metadata lived in DSpace, then Content DM, then bpress, then Islandora 7, and now it lives in Islandora 8. And so knowing that pathway is really helpful because when I would go into our metadata, I noticed that we had a lot of legacy fields that we didn't need. For example, in Islandora 7, we had a lot of bpress fields that nobody knew what they were for. And so we didn't, it was one of those things where it's like, okay, maybe we should talk about this. Another thing that we realized when we were looking at our metadata is that we had a lot of fields that were duplicated. So an example is looking at our subject field. Now, before this project, we had 3 subject fields. They were used inconsistently throughout all of our collections. And so, seeing that, it kind of gave another sense of, okay, maybe we should start talking about this because again, it's challenging to migrate all your kind of messy, inconsistent fields into a new system. The other thing that came up was looking at our metadata, or looking actually at our metadata, so within the fields. And so as any metadata librarian or cataloger or person that inputs metadata knows, there is a lot of different ways to input metadata. And so especially with us in our repository at the time, we didn't have a standard for our fields in ARMINDA. We did have individual collection standards. So to kind of expand off of that, the honors theses followed the cataloging standards, the archival collections followed the archival standards, and we had everything in between. And so what I like to do is I like to look at our date fields because that is a great representation of the many ways you can express date. And this is also, I say this not because it's a bad thing, it's just a reality when you deal with metadata. And so looking at our metadata, it kind of became apparent that we really did need to do some type of metadata cleanup in order for us to migrate from Islandora 7 into Islandora 8. So for people that don't know what creating a metadata mapping is, a metadata mapping is essentially moving stuff from one thing into another thing. So it's like when you move from one apartment to another, or it's like, in my favorite analogy, translating a book. So let's say you want to translate The Three Musketeers from French into Spanish. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to be fluent in both languages. You need to be fluent in French and you need to be fluent in Spanish. So that way when you do translate it over, you get as close to the original as possible. Very much so, it's important to know what you're dealing with. So in this kind of analogy, it's important to know what The Three Musketeers is about, know the history of France, know the idioms and the sayings, because again, you want to make sure you get as close to the original as possible because there is no direct one-to-one translation from French into Spanish. Very much the same thing when you deal with mapping metadata. It's very important to be fluent in both your schemas. So in our case, it meant being fluent in mods and it meant being fluent in RDF. as well as, understanding the content. And so in that case, it meant knowing what fields we had and what collections, what fields were repeatable, what fields were date fields, what ones were used for sorting and filtering. And basically, this is a way of saying the more you know about your metadata, the easier it is to work on a metadata mapping. And so the first thing I did when I knew that we were migrating into Islandora 8, and I knew we were going into RDF, was I started gathering as much information about our fields as possible. And so what that meant is, because I knew we had gone through so many different migrations, I knew our metadata primarily lived on spreadsheets. And so I would go out to my colleagues and I would ask them to share their most up-to-date spreadsheets with me. I'd have conversations asking them how they input their metadata into Islandora, which led me to twig templates, something I'd never heard of before. And so I was, gathering spreadsheets, gathering twigs, and then also holding conversations about if we added things directly into Islandora, if things were edited directly into Islandora, which led me to downloading hundreds of mod samples from our Islandora, and then using Oxygen to strip everything except for the mods out, because this was a way to make sure that I had a complete list of all the fields we were using, because I couldn't necessarily just rely on the spreadsheets. I couldn't rely just on the twig. I wanted to make sure I had everything. And so with gathering information from spreadsheets, from twig templates, and from the mods, I created what I called a type of directory, which basically showed me the flow of our metadata field, what it was in the spreadsheet, what the twig said it was supposed to be, and then what it was in mods. So while I was gathering all of that information, talking to people, I was also trying to figure out what RDF was. My experience of figuring out what RDF was basically like looking at a black box. And then when I finally figure out how to open that black box up, there's another black box. And so what really helped me understand where we were going was really looking at two different things. The first thing is knowing that RDF is not like mods. RDF is a framework that has mods, and mods is a schema, RDF is a framework that has schema, and mods is a schema that does not work with RDF. And so knowing this helps me realize knowing this helps me realize from the mapping from mods to RDF was going to be very complicated and unlike any other migration that I'd done before. The second thing that was very helpful was looking at the Islandora Metadata Interest Group suggested mapping spreadsheet. What this did is that it helped me understand what exactly I needed to know about RDF. And so with this spreadsheet, it lists out your mods fields, it lists out RDF mapping, but it also lists out Drupal fields, because that's something that I didn't understand at first, is that oftentimes when you talk to people about Islandora 8, they say that it's more important for you to map your fields into Drupal. But with using this, it helped me understand the relationship between Drupal and RDF. And so this was a great tool to help me understand what I needed to know going forward. And so while I was gathering all the information about our fields, while I was learning about what RDF was, we were asked to join the IMLIS grant. And so this helped us really push towards doing a rigorous metadata cleanup, because part of the grant talked about creating documentation to help people in a process that is similar to us, migrating from Islandora 7 into Islandora 8, or Fedora 3 to Fedora 6. And so with this work, with the grant, we at Whitman ended up forming the Metadata Interest Group. And this consisted of Amy Blau, Dana Bronson, and myself, with help from Kun Lin, specifically if we had questions about specific fields that were required. But for the most part in our meetings, it was the three of us, Amy, Dana, and myself, because in Whitman, we were the ones that were working with metadata the most. We had the most familiarity with metadata, although our meetings were open to other people. But we started this group in 2020, and we met every week for 1 to 2 hours, talking about the state of our metadata and doing some type of metadata assessment. And so what those meetings look like is that our meetings were organized on a Trello board. So we looked at Trello boards a lot. And on our Trello board, each card was a field we had in our institution or in Islandora. And so on each card, there were 3 attachments. The first attachment is a spreadsheet. This basically was everything from a specific field that was in our institutions or that was in Islandora. So that way we could just look at that. And so kind of to explain it a little further, talking about our subject field. As I said, we had 3 subject fields that were doing the same thing. So what this spreadsheet did is that it allowed us to look at all 3 of those subject fields in a hyper-focused way. So we could have conversations about what was going on with this specific field. The second attachment we had on our Trello board was a Google document, which I ended up calling cards. And so what this did is that, you know, with the previous attachment, we looked to see what the current state of our field was. Yeah, and then with this one, we talked about what we wanted our field to look like going forward. And so we would look at other institutions' standards for their fields. We would look at our current state of our fields, and then we would make decisions and record them here. So that way it was all in a hyper collective area because all these 3 documents were attached. And then speaking of the third document, it is a mapping, it's an RDF mapping document. And so what this document did was it looked at the MIG suggested mapping for our field. We pulled in various other suggested mappings. And again, we looked at these and we decided if this mapping fit our fields or not. And so we recorded that information here. So once we did all of that work, we talked about our field, we decided what we wanted the field to look like going forward, then we started the actual cleanup process. And so what that meant is really, this can be broken up into 2 main parts. So the first part was doing the cleanup of the fields. As I said, we had 3 fields for subject. So what that meant is that I ended up creating a spreadsheet to keep track of everything. So I would go into a spreadsheet, I would either rename the field, delete the field, or consolidate the fields, and it would be reflected on this spreadsheet. And so basically this is a way of me saying, when I cleaned up fields, it would be recorded here. So that way I would know which fields were cleaned up and which ones weren't. So it's a kind of a complicated process, but it was very helpful. The second part of cleanup consisted cleaning the actual metadata itself. And so again, we had 150 some collections within our repository. We had about 158 spreadsheets we were working with, or excuse me, 150 spreadsheets we were working with, 150 fields we were working with. And so it's a lot to keep track. And so when it came to editing the actual metadata within the fields, what was really helpful was creating a spreadsheet that tracked the larger collections and kept track of the fields in those larger collections. And so what I mean by that is saying, okay, we're going to look at our archives. We're going to look at our archives collection and say, okay, archives needs to have work type removed in all of their spreadsheets. And so that work would be reflected in this spreadsheet, whether or not it was done. The same thing with honors theses. Honors theses needed work type to be removed. And once it was removed, it would be reflected in this spreadsheet. And so it was a great way for the 3 of us to communicate what work needed to be done and whether or not that work was done. And so with all of these different spreadsheets and all these different documents, what was really helpful for me was having a one-stop shop spreadsheet. And what this did is that it was a spreadsheet basically full of equations. And so it pulled in information from various different spreadsheets. So that way, if someone had a question for me about either Twig, or if someone had a question to me about repeatability of a field, I could just go here as opposed to search the drive where that information lived. What was really helpful too was that this prevented information overloads from my colleagues. So my colleagues didn't need to know necessarily Twig information or standards for fields. They just needed to know like definitions and repeatability. And so what this did is that it helped me by this helped me by having one place to go to, but also prevented my colleagues from having to see this because it's very intimidating. And this is just one small section of a very big spreadsheet. So kind of moving a little bit on. So we did this great cleanup. We ingested all of our content and metadata into Islandora 8 through Workbench and Alan Stanley. And of course, once our metadata was in Islandora 8, we spotted some things that needed to be fixed. Again, this is something that if you work with metadata, it's not abnormal that you'll find something that needs to be fixed. And so for us, what this meant is that we needed to find an alternative way to cleaning up our metadata, because we had made the decision to say that our spreadsheets were the place where all our metadata would live. And so that meant if we saw an error or if we saw something that needed cleaning up in Islandora, we needed to clean it up in Islandora and in our spreadsheets. So this led to the creation of documentation. Specifically, this is documentation that I started working on how to clean up our taxonomies in our spreadsheets as well as in Islandora. I'm also experimenting with video as well, because it is such a new process and it is kind of complex that sometimes just seeing it and hearing it as well as having the information written out will really help understand what the process is. And so, as I said, we spent 2 years working on this cleanup process. So of course, we want to set ourselves up for success. One thing that helps us, or one thing that I'm experimenting with, is creating a local, a local control vocabulary that's a drop-down list in Google Sheets. And so what this does is that it on various different tabs in this Google Sheet, we have a list of all of our taxonomy terms that are in Islandora 8. And so what can happen is that a student worker or a library worker can come into this spreadsheet and start typing up a word. And if we have that word in Islandora 8, it'll show on the drop-down box. And what's great about this is that it provides the prefix ahead of the term if that field needs a prefix. If the field doesn't need a prefix, it won't be there. And so this is a great way to help us make sure that our taxonomy terms are clean going into Islandora 8, because it can easily get out of control. What also is very helpful with that spreadsheet is that it also shows you how to indicate if a field is repeatable. So let's say we have one cell that has 2 subject headings in it. In order for that to appear as 2 separate subject headings, it has to have a pipe. Now, throughout our metadata lifecycle, we have pipes, but we also had semicolons and we had commas. And so it's a lot of change regarding what the separating character is. And so this spreadsheet helps us understand, okay, the separating character is a pipe because it automatically gets added when you add multiple different terms to that list. And so you can see that kind of going back, you can look on the spreadsheet, there are multiple different lines. And each time you fill out a line, on the bottom, it'll say, okay, here's your first term, here's a pipe, here's a second term. So it'll already be set up for you, and you can just copy and paste that into the spreadsheet that you're working on. The next thing in regards to setting ourselves up for success is that we now have standards for our fields across ARMINDA. As I said, we originally had all of this information in cards in our Trello board. So instead of having to go and fish for every single card, what we ended up doing is combining all of that information into one Google Sheet. So that way we have one place to go to if we have a question about repeatability in a field. What I'm also doing is experimenting with GitHub and sharing the same information on a GitHub page, because this allows me to see our information in a different light and really kind of make me say if it makes sense, what our standards are, and it kind of like helps me understand if they make sense or not. And so, of course, through all of this process, there were a lot of lessons learned. the first lesson I learned was that it's really, really, really important to take breaks. This process lasted the cleanup process specifically lasted 2 years. The gathering information and figuring out RDF lasted a year before that. So it's a lot of specifics and details that you really need to know and remember. And an average work week for me during this entire process was I was gathering information on one field, I was cleaning up and talking about a second field, and I was mapping a third field, all on top of doing other work, you know, because you're a librarian, you always have other work to do. And so it was really easy to become overwhelmed. And so first lesson that I learned was it's really important to take breaks, especially because there were many times where I hit a wall and my brain crashed and I could not remember my name. So definitely remember to take breaks. The second lesson was don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions to your colleagues about their metadata, how it was ingested, what it is, because initially, as someone in my position, you're the one that's ideally helping them clean up their metadata, but also you're helping map their metadata. And you want to make sure you map it as to the best of your ability as possible. On the other hand, you want to make sure that you're not afraid to ask questions in the Islandora community, because there are many people who very much have the same question that you have. They're just afraid to ask it themselves. And so don't be afraid to ask the Islandora community. Everybody's there and they really, really want to help. And so that's something that I definitely learned. The next lesson I learned was communication. Communication is really important. This process could not have worked if we did not have good continuous communication. It would have made things so much harder. So it's really important to maintain communication. And then the last lesson I learned that I had to put up there is be mindful of your spreadsheet use. I had so many spreadsheets that I had a spreadsheet to keep track of my spreadsheets. So, and once you create a system of workflow, it's really hard to take out a spreadsheet because you can always justify why you need it. On the same note, be mindful of what you name your spreadsheets, because I can't tell you how many spreadsheets I have that are titled ARMINDA metadata fix. And it gets really confusing as to which one you're talking about, especially if they're all tied with equations. So just be very mindful of your spreadsheets. And so with that being said, thank you. And I think I have time for questions if people have questions, but thank you.
One quick comment about what Paige.
So for people that are online, Alan was just saying how our I don't want to say, I feel awkward saying this, but he was saying how our metadata was nice and clean, and thank you. Yes. How big was this transfer? Yeah, I'm not sure how many, the size wise, I'm not sure. But it was at least 9,000 items. So I guess it was relatively small, I guess, compared to larger collections. So that's why it was easier for us to do a type of metadata remediation project specifically using spreadsheets, because it was relatively small.
Question. RDF versus mods.
Repeating my explanation of RDF versus mods. So my understanding is that RDF is a schema or wow, no, that's not right. Sorry. RDF is a framework that has schema attached to it. And mods is a schema that just happens to not work well with RDF. And my understanding as to why mods does not work well with RDF is because mods is a hierarchical schema, whereas RDF wants it to be flat. And so that's my understanding as to why they don't work. Other than that, I can't really go into more detail because even now I'm still fuzzy about what RDF is. But I'm sorry. And I wish I could provide, I'm pretty sure I can provide links later on, but that's as much as I know. How did I back up my data? We didn't have any official way on how our data, are you talking specifically about our metadata? Okay, so the stuff, how do we back up the stuff going into my Islander 8? For the most part, it was which main collection you were talking with. I can mostly talk about the theses collections because that's what I'm 100% used to, is that for us, we would save it on our local drive, as well as our computers, as well as the Whitman drive. So we had several different areas where we would store that information because we really wanted to make sure that if we made a mistake, that we always could go backwards and refer to previous editions. And so that's at least what we did for theses. Any other questions? Thank you again. And I believe I put the slides up on the main conference drive. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Yeah, thank you.